The morning sun painted golden streaks across the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport as Flight 2317 prepared for its journey to Chicago. Captain Thomas Singh walked through the terminal, his pilot's uniform crisp and neat, rolling his flight bag behind him. After 20 years in the cockpit, he could tell it was going to be an interesting day. Call it pilot's intuition. The pre-flight checklist went smoothly as always. Weather reports showed clear skies ahead, and the maintenance crew had given the Boeing 737 a clean bill of health. As Thomas sipped his coffee in the cockpit, he could hear the familiar buzz of passengers boarding through the cabin door behind him. That's when he first noticed them. The sound of loud laughter and heavy boots caught his attention. Through the small cockpit window, he watched as 5 burly men in leather vests made their way across the tarmac. Their motorcycle club patches caught the morning light, and even from a distance, Thomas could tell they'd started their party early. Way too early for a 9 a.m. flight. Flight attendant Lee stopped by the cockpit, her usual cheerful smile slightly strained. "Heads up, Captain. We've got a rowdy bunch in rows 12 through 14. They've already asked about drink service 3 times during boarding." Thomas nodded, thinking back to his days of handling difficult situations, not just as a commercial pilot, but during his 8 years flying transport missions for the Marines. He'd seen his share of tough customers, but something about this group made him uneasy. Still, he kept his trademark calm demeanor as he picked up the PA microphone. "Good morning, folks. This is your captain speaking. We're looking at a smooth 2-hour flight to Chicago today. Current temperature at our destination is 68 degrees with partly cloudy skies. We'll be starting our pushback in about 5 minutes." As he made the announcement, he could hear more boisterous laughter from the cabin, followed by someone mockingly repeating his words. The other passengers were noticeably quiet, that uncomfortable silence that falls when people are trying not to attract unwanted attention. Through the cabin camera feed, Thomas watched the scene unfold. The bikers were spreading out, taking up more space than their seats allowed, elbows jutting into the aisles. One of them was already arguing with another passenger about the reclined seat in front of him. Lee returned to the cockpit, this time with a concerned look. "They're demanding pre-flight drinks. I've told them service doesn't start until we're at cruising altitude, but they're not taking no for an answer." Thomas took another sip of his coffee, his mind already running through various scenarios and protocols. 20 years of flying had taught him that prevention was better than cure. He'd seen countless situations diffused before they could escalate, but he'd also seen simple disagreements turn into full-blown crises at 35,000 feet. He reached for the logbook, noting down the time and the initial signs of disruptive behavior. It was a small action, but experience had taught him to document everything. Behind him, the sound of the boarding door closing echoed through the cabin, followed by more loud commentary from the bikers about finally getting this show on the road. As the ground crew gave their final signals and the pushback began, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would test every bit of his experience. The morning sun now fully illuminated the cockpit, and as they taxied toward the runway, he mentally prepared himself for what might come. Sometimes the calm before the storm was the best time to prepare for turbulence, both literal and figurative. Little did those bikers know, they had chosen the wrong flight, the wrong day, and definitely the wrong pilot to test. As Thomas guided the aircraft toward the runway, he reflected on how his years of military service had taught him that the best solutions often came from staying cool under pressure and thinking 3 steps ahead. The real question was, would he need to use those skills today? The first 30 minutes of Flight 2317 passed smoothly as the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude. The seat belt sign had just been turned off when the trouble began brewing like an incoming storm. The 5 bikers, who had been impatiently waiting for drink service, were already showing signs of their pre-flight drinking spree. Flight attendant Lee was making her way down the aisle with the beverage cart when the first disruptive incident occurred. The largest of the bikers, a man with a thick gray beard and weathered leather vest, stuck his leg out into the aisle, nearly causing her to trip. His friends erupted in laughter, while nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Come on, sweetheart, we've been waiting forever," the bearded man called out, his words slightly slurred. "How about some VIP service for paying customers?" His friends joined in with similar comments, their voices carrying throughout the cabin. In row 16, a mother pulled her young son closer, trying to distract him with a tablet. An elderly couple in row 11 exchanged worried glances. A businessman in a crisp suit pretended to be deeply engrossed in his laptop, though his tense shoulders betrayed his awareness of the situation. Through the cabin camera feed, Captain Thomas watched the scene unfold. He noticed how the bikers had spread out, creating their own rowdy zone in the middle of the aircraft. They were passing around a water bottle that Thomas strongly suspected wasn't filled with water. The cabin crew handled the situation professionally, maintaining their composure as they served drinks. But when Lee politely informed the group that they would be limited to one alcoholic beverage each, due to their visible intoxication, the atmosphere shifted from merely unpleasant to potentially dangerous. "Who do you think you are?" demanded one of the bikers, a stocky man with a bandana. "We paid for these tickets just like everyone else." His voice carried an edge that made several nearby passengers flinch. The bearded leader of the group stood up, swaying slightly. "Where's your supervisor? Better yet, get the pilot out here. I want to file a complaint about discrimination against motorcycle clubs." In the cockpit, Thomas reached for the intercom to contact the lead flight attendant. "Kim, what's the situation back there?" His voice remained calm, but his mind was already running through various scenarios and protocols. "They're getting more aggressive, Captain," Kim replied quietly. "They're demanding more drinks and threatening to file complaints." One of them tried to follow Lee into the galley area. A commotion erupted in the cabin as two of the bikers got up to use the bathroom simultaneously, bumping into other passengers without apologizing. Their loud complaints about the tiny aisles and cramped space filled the aircraft. Thomas noticed a young flight attendant, Chen, trying to direct one of them back to his seat, only to be met with a dismissive wave and a mocking comment about airline hospitality. The other passengers were becoming visibly distressed, some pressing their call buttons to request seat changes. The situation escalated further when the bikers started playing music from a phone, ignoring requests to use headphones. The tinny sound of heavy metal competed with the aircraft's engine noise, creating a chaotic atmosphere that put everyone on edge. In row 15, a small child started crying, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and tension. Instead of showing any concern, the bikers laughed and made comments about kids these days, causing the parent to protectively huddle closer to their child. Thomas had seen enough. As a former Marine pilot, he recognized the signs of a situation spiraling out of control. The bikers were testing boundaries, getting bolder with each unchallenged action. Their behavior was following a familiar pattern he'd seen before: people who mistake kindness for weakness, pushing limits until someone pushes back. Through the cabin camera, he watched as Lee tried one more time to maintain order, approaching the group with professional courtesy despite their previous behavior. "Gentlemen, I need to remind you of our in-flight policies." She was cut off mid-sentence by the bearded leader. "Save your policies. We want to speak to the pilot now." His demand was accompanied by a fist pounding on the armrest, causing nearby passengers to jump in their seats. As Thomas reached for the radio to contact air traffic control, he knew the next few minutes would be crucial. He had dealt with difficult situations before, both in commercial and military aviation, but this one was different. These men weren't just being unruly, they were deliberately creating an atmosphere of intimidation. The question wasn't if he needed to act, but how. With severe weather systems blocking most diversion routes and 143 passengers counting on him, Thomas knew he needed a solution that would maintain both safety and schedule. As he watched the bikers continuing their disruptive behavior, a plan began forming in his mind, one that would draw upon every bit of his experience and cunning. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point when Lee finally had to take a firm stand. "I'm sorry, sir, but I cannot serve you any more alcohol," she said, her voice steady despite the intimidating situation. The bearded leader of the bikers stood up, using his height to tower over her. "This is ridiculous," he growled, his voice carrying through the cabin. "First, you make us wait forever for drinks, and now you're cutting us off." His friends joined in, creating a wall of hostile faces in the middle of the aircraft. A passenger in business attire tried to intervene. "Come on, guys, let's keep it civil," he suggested, only to be met with harsh glares that made him shrink back into his seat. The bikers had created their own zone of intimidation, and no one dared to challenge them directly. Up in the cockpit, Captain Thomas was receiving constant updates through the intercom. Each report painted a clearer picture of a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. His co-pilot, Rodriguez, turned to him with concern etched on his face. "Should we consider diverting?" Before Thomas could respond, the cabin intercom buzzed again. "Captain," Lee's voice was tight with tension, "they're demanding to speak with you. The leader says he won't sit down until he talks to you face to face." Thomas took a deep breath, memories of his Marine Corps days flooding back. He remembered similar situations during his military flights. Different scenario, same psychology. People who tried to dominate through intimidation often didn't know how to react when they met someone who understood their game better than they did. The lead biker's voice suddenly boomed through the cabin. "Hey, pilot! Either you come out here or I'm coming in there." The threat hung in the air, causing several passengers to gasp. A mother covered her child's ears, while an elderly couple held hands tightly. Thomas pressed the intercom button. "This is your captain speaking. I understand there's a concern about our beverage service. I want to assure everyone that our cruise decisions are made with passenger safety in mind." "Safety? This is discrimination," the biker shouted back. His friends started chanting, come out," like it was some kind of twisted game. The entire cabin atmosphere had transformed from uncomfortable to genuinely frightening. Rodriguez looked at Thomas. "You're not actually going to go out there, are you?" He knew the protocols. Pilots were supposed to stay in the cockpit during disturbances. But Thomas had already unstrapped his seatbelt. He'd spent 8 years in the Marines before joining commercial aviation. He'd flown through combat zones, handled emergency landings, and dealt with every kind of difficult situation imaginable. These bikers had no idea who they were challenging. "Keep us steady," Thomas instructed Rodriguez. "I'll handle this." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse situations and come through them. As Thomas stood up, he caught his reflection in the cockpit window. His uniform was pristine, his posture straight, every inch the commanding presence he needed to be. He wasn't just going to confront the troublemakers, he was going to give them a lesson they'd never forget. In the cabin, the bikers were still causing chaos. One of them had started playing loud music from his phone again, while another was making crude jokes about airline service. They thought they had the upper hand, that their intimidation tactics would work just like they probably had countless times before. Lee met Thomas at the cockpit door. "Captain, are you sure about this?" she whispered. "They're really worked up." Her concern was visible, but Thomas gave her a reassuring nod. "Trust me," he said quietly. "I've dealt with worse in places a lot more dangerous than this." He straightened his uniform one last time, his military training evident in every movement. As Thomas stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers who had been shrinking in their seats sat up straighter, seeing their captain's confident stride. The bikers, expecting perhaps a nervous airline pilot, found themselves facing something entirely different. Thomas moved down the aisle with purpose, his presence commanding respect without saying a word. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes the most powerful message was silent. It was all about how you carried yourself. The bearded leader of the bikers stood up again, trying to use his height advantage, but Thomas wasn't intimidated. He'd stared down bigger threats in war zones. This wasn't just about handling a few unruly passengers anymore. It was about protecting everyone on this flight. As they stood face to face in the narrow aisle, the entire cabin held its breath. The next few moments would determine how this confrontation would play out, and Thomas had no intention of letting these bullies win. He had a plan, one that would use their own aggression against them in a way they'd never expect. Captain Thomas stood in the narrow aisle, facing the bearded biker leader. The entire cabin was silent, every passenger watching the confrontation unfold. Even the usual background noise of the aircraft engines seemed muted, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. "I understand there's a problem here," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying authority that came from years of military service. The biker leader shifted his weight, clearly thrown off by the captain's composed demeanor. "Yeah, there's a problem," the biker growled, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. "Your crew is discriminating against us. We paid good money for these tickets, and we're being treated like second-class citizens." Thomas glanced at his watch, then at the weather radar display visible through the cockpit door. dark patches of severe weather systems blocked most of their diversion routes. Extended emergency landing would mean a 3-hour delay for everyone aboard, not to mention the ripple effect on connecting flights affecting dozens more passengers. The co-pilot's voice crackled through Thomas's earpiece. Air traffic control says the weather's getting worse to the south. If we're going to divert, we need to decide soon. Looking around the cabin, Thomas saw the faces of his passengers. A young couple returning from their honeymoon, their hands clasped together. An elderly man who had mentioned this was his first flight in 20 years. A group of teachers heading to an education conference. 143 people who trusted him to get them to their destination safely. The bikers' friends had started standing up too, creating an intimidating wall of leather vests and angry faces. One of them cracked his knuckles, a theatrical gesture that might have worked in a bar but seemed almost comical at 35,000 feet. Thomas's mind raced through his options. Standard protocol was clear: divert to the nearest airport and have law enforcement waiting. But something about that solution felt wrong. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes following the rulebook exactly wasn't the best way to handle a situation. "Sir," Lee whispered from behind him, "we have families with children on board. If this escalates..." That's when it hit him. Thomas remembered a training exercise from his military days when his instructor had taught him about psychological warfare. Sometimes, the instructor had said, the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them defeat themselves. He looked at the bikers again, noting their slightly unsteady stance, the glassy look in their eyes from pre-flight drinking. They were trying to be intimidating, but they were also trapped in a pressurized tube 6 miles above the Earth, subject to the same laws of physics as everyone else. "Rodriguez," he spoke quietly into his headset, "check the weather pattern ahead. Specifically, look for areas of light to moderate turbulence." His co-pilot's response came back confused but professional. "Found some. About 10 minutes ahead, if we adjust our course slightly west." Thomas made his decision. It wasn't by the book, but neither was his background. 20 years of commercial flying combined with 8 years of military service had taught him that sometimes the best solutions weren't found in any manual. He turned to Lee, speaking low enough that only she could hear. "I need you to make an announcement. Tell everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Cite unexpected turbulence ahead." "What are you planning?" she whispered back, her eyes showing both concern and trust. "Sometimes," Thomas said, allowing himself a small smile, "the best way to handle bullies is to let them experience the consequences of their own behavior." He turned back to the biker leader, who was still trying to look intimidating despite the cramped airplane aisle somewhat ruining the effect. "Sir, I understand your concerns. However, right now, I need everyone to return to their seats immediately." "Or what?" the biker challenged, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Or," Thomas said calmly, "the next few minutes are going to be very uncomfortable for everyone standing up." As if on cue, the aircraft gave a small shudder. Some of the more experienced travelers recognized it as the harbinger of turbulence, while the bikers barely seemed to notice. Thomas turned and walked back to the cockpit, his mind already plotting the course adjustments they would need to make. Behind him, he heard Lee's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're expecting some unexpected turbulence ahead." As he settled back into the pilot's seat, Thomas allowed himself another small smile. In his experience, sometimes the best decisions weren't about choosing between right and wrong, but finding a creative solution that solved multiple problems at once. The bikers wanted special treatment. Well, they were about to get it, just not the kind they were expecting. Back in the cockpit, Captain Thomas adjusted his headset and exchanged a knowing look with Rodriguez. His co-pilot raised an eyebrow, beginning to understand the plan. Through the cabin camera feed, they could see the bikers still standing in the aisle, ignoring Lee's announcement about returning to their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas's voice came through the intercom, calm and professional. "This is your captain speaking. We're approaching an area of unexpected turbulence. For your safety, please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." The regular passengers quickly complied, recognizing the serious tone in the captain's voice. A flight attendant helped an elderly passenger tighten his seatbelt. Parents checked their children's restraints, but the bikers remained standing, their leader even making a show of laughing at the announcement. "Weather system coming up in 2 minutes," Rodriguez reported quietly. On their radar, they could see exactly what they were heading into. Nothing dangerous, but definitely uncomfortable for anyone not properly seated. Thomas made a slight adjustment to their course, threading the needle between two air masses. He'd done this countless times during his military service, although usually to avoid anti-aircraft fire rather than teach a lesson to unruly passengers. The technique was the same. It was all about timing and precision. Through the cabin camera, he could see Lee making one final attempt to reason with the bikers. "Please, gentlemen, you need to be seated now." The bearded leader waved her off dismissively, still playing to his audience of friends. The first subtle bump came as a warning. A few passengers gripped their armrests, but the bikers just braced themselves against the overhead compartments, still standing. Thomas watched the weather radar, waiting for exactly the right moment. He keyed the intercom one last time. "Cabin crew, take your seats immediately." There was an urgency in his voice that made everyone but the bikers snap to attention. Even their leader's cocky smile faltered slightly. Then it began. Thomas guided the aircraft into what pilots call light chop, nothing dangerous, but enough to make the plane dance a little. The bikers stumbled, trying to maintain their tough guy poses while grabbing for support. "Might get a little bumpy," Thomas announced, his voice steady as he increased their angle slightly. The aircraft responded perfectly, hitting a pocket of disrupted air that made it shudder. The first biker to lose his balance was the one with the bandana. He grabbed for a seat back but missed, landing awkwardly in an empty seat. His friends laughed, but their laughter was nervous now, their bravado cracking. Thomas made another subtle adjustment, threading between air masses like a skilled sailor navigating waves. The plane rose and dipped in a gentle but persistent rhythm. Even the most seasoned travelers were gripping their armrests now. The bearded leader, still trying to maintain his authority, pointed toward the cockpit. "You think this scares us?" he called out, but his voice wavered as another shake made him stumble. Regular passengers, now understanding what was happening, tried to hide their smiles. A young boy whispered to his mother, "The pilot's really good at this, isn't he?" She nodded, suppressing a grin. Through it all, Thomas maintained perfect control. Each movement of the aircraft was calculated, designed not to frighten but to unsettle. It was like a dance, one he'd perfected over years of flying through much worse conditions. Another shake, slightly stronger, and two more bikers gave up, practically falling into their seats. Their faces had taken on a distinctly greenish tinge. The leader, now standing alone, was swaying like a tree in the wind. "Air sickness bags are located in the seat pocket in front of you," Lee announced helpfully, her professional tone barely hiding her satisfaction as she watched the tough guy's composure crumble. The final straw came when Thomas hit a perfectly timed series of bumps. The leader's legs finally gave way, and he collapsed into his seat, fumbling frantically for his seatbelt. His face had lost all color, and he was eyeing the air sickness bag with increasing interest. Throughout the cabin, other passengers sat securely in their seats, many of them hiding smiles behind magazines or hands. They'd just witnessed a masterclass in handling bullies without ever raising a voice or throwing a punch. Weather system clearing in about 2 minutes, Rodriguez reported, unable to keep a note of admiration out of his voice. "Nice flying, Captain." Thomas nodded, already smoothing out their flight path. He'd made his point without endangering anyone or breaking any regulations. The bikers had effectively put themselves in their place, and he hadn't had to divert the flight or delay a single passenger. As the turbulence eased, he glanced at the cabin camera one last time. The once rowdy bikers were now slumped in their seats, all thoughts of causing trouble replaced by desperate attempts to keep their stomachs steady. Sometimes, he reflected, the best way to handle a storm was to guide people right through it. The aftermath of Captain Thomas's tactical turbulence was something to behold. As the aircraft leveled out into smooth air, the cabin had transformed into a completely different atmosphere from just minutes before. The once intimidating bikers were now slumped in their seats, their tough guy personas completely deflated along with their stomachs. The bearded leader, who had been so vocal about his demands earlier, was now intensely focused on the air sickness bag in his hands, his face a shade of green that would make a crayon manufacturer proud. His friends weren't faring any better. Each one looked like they'd just stepped off a spinning carnival ride after eating too many corn dogs. Through the cabin camera, Thomas watched as Lee made her way down the aisle, offering ginger ale and crackers to the queasy troublemakers. Her professional demeanor never wavered, though there was a slight twinkle in her eye as she attended to the now humbled passengers. "Would you like some water?" she asked the bandana-wearing biker, who could only shake his head weakly in response. His previously loud voice had been reduced to a mumble as he pressed his forehead against the cool window. Other passengers were trying their best to hide their amusement. A businessman who had earlier shrunk from the biker's intimidation was now calmly typing on his laptop, occasionally glancing over with barely concealed satisfaction. A young couple exchanged knowing looks, their earlier tension replaced by relieved smiles. "How are our friends doing back there?" Rodriguez asked quietly in the cockpit, checking their flight path to Chicago. Thomas glanced at the cabin feed again. "Let's just say they've lost their appetite for trouble," he replied, allowing himself a small smile. His years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best solutions were the ones that let people learn their lessons naturally. The elderly couple who had been nervously holding hands earlier were now chatting quietly, occasionally looking back at the bikers with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. The woman even offered her spare pack of crackers to one of them, earning a weak nod of thanks in return. Through the private crew communication system, Thomas sent a message to be displayed on the flight attendants' tablets: "Situation stabilized. Maintain normal service schedule." He knew the importance of returning the flight to its routine, letting the incident fade into just another story for passengers to tell when they landed. Lee made another pass through the cabin, this time with the regular drink service cart. When she reached the bikers' rows, their earlier demands for alcohol had mysteriously vanished. Instead, they meekly requested water and ginger ale, some still clutching their airsickness bags like life preservers. The transformation was remarkable. The same men who had been throwing their weight around and demanding special treatment were now the model of docile passengers. One of them even apologized in a shaky voice when he accidentally bumped Lee's cart with his elbow. Parents who had been protectively shielding their children earlier were now relaxed, some even using the incident as a teaching moment. "See," one mother whispered to her curious child, "being a bully never works out well in the end." The lesson hadn't been lost on anyone. Without raising his voice or making a single threat, Captain Thomas had shown that true authority comes from skill and wisdom, not from intimidation and loud voices. The bikers had learned this lesson the hard way, at 35,000 feet. Through it all, the regular passengers had gained a new appreciation for their flight crew. They'd witnessed a masterclass in problem-solving, where violence was replaced with strategy, and confrontation was handled with professional calm. A flight attendant came to the cockpit with an update. "They're asking about the flight time remaining," she reported, trying to keep a straight face. "I think they're hoping it's not too long." Thomas checked their flight data. "Tell them we're making good time," he said. "And maybe mention that the air ahead looks nice and smooth." The last part was delivered with just a hint of emphasis, causing the flight attendant to bite back a smile. Looking at the weather radar, Thomas could see they had clear skies all the way to Chicago now. The storm, both the meteorological and behavioral ones, had passed. In the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to almost peaceful, with only the occasional sound of a queasy biker breaking the normal ambient noise of flight. Rodriguez shook his head in admiration. "You know, in all my years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle a situation quite like that," he said. "Those guys won't be causing trouble on any flights again anytime soon." Thomas nodded, making a small adjustment to their course. "Sometimes the best lessons are the ones people teach themselves," he replied. The wisdom of his military training combined with years of commercial flying had paid off in ways his instructors probably never imagined. Thomas nodded, making a small adjustment to their course. "Sometimes the best lessons are the ones people teach themselves," he replied. The wisdom of his military training combined with years of commercial flying had paid off in ways his instructors probably never imagined. As Flight 2317 began its descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the scene in the cabin was vastly different from a few hours ago. The five bikers, once so full of swagger and intimidation, were now the quietest passengers on the plane. Their leather vests seemed to hang a bit looser on their shoulders, their tough guy personas permanently deflated by the experience. Captain Thomas's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Chicago. Local time is 11:42 a.m. and the weather is clear with light winds. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your seat belts are fastened." The bearded leader, who had demanded to speak to the pilot so forcefully earlier, now looked like he might never want to see a pilot again in his life. He was still clutching an airsickness bag, though it had been a while since he needed it. His friends were in similar states, their faces having progressed from green to a more natural, if somewhat pale, complexion. Through the cabin camera, Thomas watched as Lee made her final checks. She paused briefly by the biker's rows. "How are you gentlemen feeling now?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right mix of professional concern and subtle reminder of their earlier behavior. "We're fine," mumbled the biker with the bandana, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thanks for the ginger ale earlier." His words of gratitude came out awkwardly, like someone unused to saying them, but they were genuine. As the plane descended through the clouds, other passengers began gathering their belongings, some of them sharing knowing looks and small smiles. The businessman who had tried to intervene earlier caught Lee's eye and gave her a thumbs up when the bikers weren't looking. The aircraft touched down smoothly, one of Thomas's best landings, though the bikers might not have appreciated the skill involved. As they taxied to the gate, he could see police vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Standard protocol for reported in-flight disturbances meant law enforcement would be meeting the flight. The cabin crew made their usual announcements about remaining seated until the aircraft came to a complete stop. This time, there were no jokes or interruptions from the middle rows. In fact, the bikers seemed to be trying to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible. When the aircraft door opened, 2 police officers boarded. They were expecting to deal with aggressive troublemakers, but instead found 5 very subdued men who could barely look up from their shoes. The lead officer consulted his notebook, looking confused at the disconnect between the reported disturbance and the queasy, humble passengers before him. Lee approached the officers and spoke quietly. "The situation has been resolved," she explained, trying to keep the amusement out of her voice. "Though you might want to have a word with them about proper flight etiquette." As the bikers were escorted off the plane, other passengers finally let their reactions show. A ripple of applause spread through the cabin, not just for the handling of the troublemakers, but for the entire crew's professionalism throughout the incident. Thomas emerged from the cockpit to thank his passengers for their patience. The applause grew louder, and several people stood up to shake his hand. The elderly couple who had been so frightened earlier came forward to express their gratitude. "In all my years of flying," the elderly man said, "I've never seen anything handled so perfectly." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "You made us feel safe without any violence or ugliness. That's real skill." Later, during the incident debriefing, the airline's safety committee reviewed the flight records. They found that every protocol had been followed, every regulation observed. Captain Thomas had managed to resolve a potentially dangerous situation without endangering anyone or even causing delays. The story spread quickly through airline circles. It became a case study in passenger management, taught to new flight crews as an example of how experience, quick thinking, and a cool head could diffuse even the most volatile situations. As for the bikers, word got around their club about what happened. Their tough reputation took quite a hit when the story spread about how they'd been humbled by a bit of light turbulence. Some say they switched to traveling by road after that, deciding that maybe the skies weren't their territory after all. A month later, Thomas received a letter. It was from the bearded leader of the biker group, something that surprised even him. The letter was brief but sincere. "I want to apologize for our behavior on that flight. You taught us a lesson we needed to learn, and you did it without throwing a single punch. That's real strength. We won't be causing trouble on any more flights." Thomas pinned the letter to the crew room bulletin board, where it served as a reminder that sometimes the best way to handle a storm isn't to fight it, but to guide people through it until they find their own way to calmer skies.